The wind, the land, and the arrival of Lona. The wind that morning came sharp off the northern plains, the kind that carried more than just cold. It carried grit, fine enough to rasp against the teeth, frost thin as a breath that could crawl under every seam of a coat. It howled low across the flats outside Deadmare Bluff, dragging pale light from a reluctant sun up over the ridgeline. By the time it touched the frozen mud on the main road, 2 sets of impressions had already scarred its surface. The deep measured marks of a war horse's shod hooves and the parallel press of a single pair of boots. They ran side by side like soldier and shadow, straight toward the edge of town. She came from the north, where the war never truly ended, where the survivors learned to wear silence heavier than armor. Her coat was a ragged thing, stitched and restitched in thread so dark it might have been pulled from the sinew of some long-dead beast. The buttons were mismatched and stained, one hanging on by the last twist of its thread. Beneath it, trousers patched at the knees and thighs in square after square, each a different shade of brown or gray. On her head sat a wide-brimmed hat so sun-bleached and beaten that its original color had been erased by years of weather and war. The horse beside her was no farmyard animal. It was taller than most cavalry mounts, its black mane roped into old braids that had half come undone, decorated with scraps of faded ribbon that might once have been military service colors. Its eyes were a jaundiced yellow, sharp and cold as old coin. It walked with a slow, unbothered step as if it had paced battle lines and knew there was nothing here worth hurrying for. No one asked her name. The barkeep leaning on his porch rail at dawn didn't. The sheriff who tracked her progress from the far end of the street didn't either, though his fingers rested lightly on the butt of his sidearm. She carried herself like someone who had long since learned that names were only as useful as the distance you kept from them. She walked as if she could shoot through a storm and come out the other side with her hat still on and her heartbeat unchanged. She didn't ride. She led the horse as if it were kin a blood brother stitched to her shadow. The tack was nothing like ranchers used, no saddle, only worn campaign gear loops of leather for quick release and a fraying length of rope. At the horse's flank, lashed into a scabbard, was a rifle, so weathered its stock shone smooth as glass from years of use. The town gave her space without needing to be told. Dust swirled in her wake, curling around her boots, before settling back into the frozen road as if even the land didn't care to hold her tracks for long. Purpose and destination. Lona Briggs did not come to Deadmare Bluff because she was starving or desperate. There was enough meat in the hills and enough grit in her belly to see her through the winter. What she lacked was not food, but shelter, a roof solid enough to keep the wind from tearing her apart in her sleep. A door with a lock she could bar from the inside, and maybe if luck was cruel enough, to offer it a reason to keep the name she'd been born with. The talk in town had drifted her way without her asking. Folks said a man named Witt seldom owned more land than any 3 men in the county combined. His ranch lay 10 miles out through mesquite scrub and gully cuts, in the kind of bad ground where the earth sometimes spat up bones animal and otherwise crooked and pale in the sun. The fences were white, the guards were paid well, and the quiet around the place was the kind that felt less like peace and more like the warning stillness before a trigger pull. They said he'd made his fortune on blood and oil, riding the backs of good men into worse causes, leaving behind those who didn't serve his end. 1,000 head of cattle grazed under his brand, and his house had more bedrooms than kin to fill them. Last week, he'd put the word out for a housekeeper. The requirements were plain: no drunks, no criminals, no one with debts, or a lawman at their heels. The work cooked so clean was to be done without complaint and without noise. He hadn't mentioned scars. He hadn't mentioned women who wore a revolver on the hip and had hands calloused to fit a rifle grip like a second skin. It was the kind of offer that should have turned her heel, but instead it pulled her forward. Because if a man wanted silence, he might just leave a woman to her own shadows. And that was worth more than gold. First meeting with Wit. Seldom. She arrived at the ranch the morning after the season's first snowfall. The high ridges around it dusted white like war paint. Frost clung to the fence posts. A Mexican hand met her at the gate, his face shadowed by a hat brim and years of hard sun. He looked from her to the horse and back again, then spat near his boot heel. You lost Niña Lona, held his gaze without blinking. Silence stretched heavy as a cocked pistol before she answered, voice low and flat. No, I'm the help. He barked a laugh. Senor Seldom asked for a woman, not a corpse. She shrugged once and walked past him. He didn't stop her. The main house loomed ahead, white-pillared like something stolen from a San Antonio bank and dropped into the dust. Men with shotguns stood at the steps, their eyes narrowing as she approached. The war horse snorted a low warning sound and stared them down with the confidence of something that had survived worse than men. Wit Seldom stood at the top of the stairs. His coat was black and trimmed in fox fur boots polished, but his eyes were the color of tarnished iron. You can cook, yes. You drink, no. You got anyone who'd come looking if you vanished? No. He studied her like a man weighing the odds of a loaded gun. Name Lona. He nodded once. You start now. My mother's room needs airing. Dinner by 6. Stay out of the east wing. She nodded boots, leaving thin prints on the porch. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and something older, something that had never left. A piano sat in the foyer, its strings dead. Dust clung to every surface, not in motion. Somewhere deep in the walls, rats moved, and the house seemed to watch her as much as the man had. She moved through it like she'd been there before, like she already knew not to open the wrong doors. Early days, and the weight of silence. The work itself was simple enough: meat over the fire, bread thick with salt floors scrubbed until the wood took on a pale, thirsty sheen. What was not simple was the silence. It wrapped itself around the place like a shroud hanging in the rafters, settling in the corners, waiting to be noticed. Lona chose a narrow room near the kitchen to sleep in, far from the servants' quarters, far from where voices might carry. She barred the door with a chair before lying down each night, boots still within reach, rifle closer. The war horse was tethered beneath the kitchen window. It did not wander. It did not sleep, not truly. It stood as if carved from black iron nostrils, flaring at scents only it understood. Sometimes, in the dead stretch before dawn, its ears would flick sharply toward the tree line, and the muscles in its neck would tense like a bowstring. By the third night, Lona began to hear the house in ways that didn't make sense. Certain floorboards gave a drawn-out groan when no weight was on them, the sound stretching across rooms as if something invisible was walking there. Doors she'd closed with care stood open. By morning, the crack of light through them like a sliver of an uninvited grin. Once in the pantry, she heard the faint, deliberate tap, tap, tap of dripping water, though there was no pipe and no barrel. She didn't speak of it to Seldom or the hands. Men who worked for someone like him learned early not to talk about what didn't touch their pay. Still, she salted the kitchen threshold every morning and left a crust of bread out in the corners. The rats never came near it. The mother's room. On the fourth day, she found the room Seldom had mentioned, first his mother's. The door was stiff hinges, complaining like an old man woken too soon. The air inside was stale heavy with the remnants of lavender that had long since rotted sweet into mold. The curtains were yellowed and brittle, crumbling in her hands when she drew them back. A portrait loomed above the cold fireplace, a pale woman with hair drawn back tight enough to pull at the skin around her temples, eyes as hard and flat as winter glass. She wore no smile, no jewelry, only a high collar that seemed meant to keep her throat safe from the world. Lona worked in silence, stripping the bed, hauling the linens to the wash. She beat dust from the rugs until the air was thick with motes, sunlight catching them like drifting ash. Every corner gave up its hidden debris reluctantly, as though the room itself resented her intrusion. It was when she knelt to sweep beneath the bed that her fingers caught on something small and solid. She pulled it into the light, a doll once fine, now faceless, its cloth features torn away entirely. The hands had been bound tightly behind its back with a length of black thread. The knot was intricate, the kind made by someone who knew how to tie wrists to a chair. She didn't keep it. She took it outside to the stone ring where the kitchen fire was fed and burned it until only ash and a faint smell of scorched wool remained. The wind scattered what was left, but she swore the horse outside shifted its weight uneasily until the last ember died. The first conversation about her past. It was late that same night when she heard the soft creak of the kitchen door. Seldom stepped inside his boots, making almost no sound on the worn floorboards. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting just enough light to catch the edge of his profile. Dark coat still on collar, turned up against a wind that hadn't followed him inside. She was slicing onions with her boot knife, the steel flashing dull in the firelight. He watched her a long moment before speaking. "You fought," he said. It wasn't a question. Her hands didn't slow. "I survived." He nodded toward the horse tied outside. "That beast is Frontier Corps. They trained them for raiding, for killing." "It's mine," she said simply. His gaze sharpened. "You kill men?" "Yes." No judgment in his eyes, only the slow, deliberate nod of a man confirming something he already suspected. He took a drink from a glass she hadn't seen him pour, then left without another word. The door closed behind him, and the fire popped, throwing sparks that skittered across the hearthstone. By the end of that first week, Lona knew every unlocked corner of the house, and she had marked every door she'd yet to open. The east wing remained untouched, but she could feel it there, breathing under the skin of the walls, patient as winter and twice as cold. Strange signs and echoes from the past. It began with the kind of noises a house shouldn't make. Footsteps in the east wing measured deliberate when every servant was accounted for in the main hall. The cadence was wrong for the guards, too slow, too heavy. Sometimes the sound would stop mid-step as though whatever was making it had realized it was being listened to. At night, she heard breathing on the other side of walls, too thick for sound to pass through. It wasn't the breath of a man. It had a damp, rattling depth, the kind lungs get when they've been wet too long. On the fifth evening, a boy appeared in the kitchen doorway. He couldn't have been more than 7, thin as wire, pale as riverstone. His clothes were plain but too clean for any of the ranch hand's kin. He held a tin soldier missing both legs, the metal dulled with age and handling. The boy didn't speak, just watched her with an unreadable expression. Lona handed him a cup of water. He drank without thanks, then turned and walked into the pantry. She followed a few seconds later, but the pantry was empty. No window, no second door. The next morning she searched. It was only when she shifted a stack of flour sacks that she saw it, a narrow panel, edges warped, leading into a crawl space that sloped down. She followed its curve, ducking low, her fingertips tracing brick older than the house itself. Roots hung from the ceiling like knotted hair, and the smell was a thick blend of damp earth and rusted iron. The passage bent sharply before spitting her out behind the stables. The war horse was already there, ears pinned, flat lips peeled from its teeth in a silent snarl. Lona saw the print's hoof marks, but too narrow for a draft horse, too deep for a deer. She crouched and touched one. Split hoof. Cloven. She stood slowly scanning the tree line. The wind shifted, carrying a smell she hadn't encountered since before the war cordite, faint but undeniable. Vanishings, and the first message. A week passed before the first man vanished. He'd been at breakfast loud with the others, and by noon his plate was cold, his place empty. By dusk the foreman found his boots standing neatly by the water trough, laces still tied. Beside them a splash of blood already darkening in the frost. There was no body. Seldom's response was to tell the foreman to dig another hole. No questions, no searches. The other hands took their cue from him. That night, Lona found something carved into the lintel of her bedroom door, letters deep enough to catch her fingertip. I remember the fort. She stared at it for a long time. Her breath slow, deliberate. The Fort Laramie ambush was supposed to have no survivors. She knew because she had ridden away from it, and she had buried that trail under miles of silence. The next morning she walked the fence line and found more signs, small deliberate marks on the posts, almost like tally lines. The wood scorched in places with burns too precise to be lightning. The war horse paced beside her, nostrils flaring. The coyote and the boy's return. 2 days later, she found the coyote. It hung from a cottonwood by its hind legs, throat slit clean. The snow beneath it was etched with the same words from her door, I remember the fort. The bark around the trunk was charred in patches, black scars that smelled faintly of powder burns. On one side was a small, perfect ring of blackened wood, like the imprint of a bullet that had struck and burned instead of shattering. She touched it with a gloved hand, then wiped her palm on her coat. Some memories were best kept from the skin. That evening the boy returned. He came into the kitchen while she was cutting rabbit, his toy soldier still in hand. This time he spoke. "You're gonna kill him," he said. She didn't answer. "You smell like the fort," he added. "Like fire and dead men." "What's your name?" she asked. Her voice was dry, unused. He shook his head. "I forget. Where do you sleep?" He pointed toward the east wing, the one Seldom had told her to leave alone. She gave him meat from the rabbit. He ate it in both hands, no chewing, just swallowing in quick, sharp gulps. When he was done, he wiped his mouth with his sleeve, turned and disappeared behind the cupboard again. The house felt heavier after that. She sat awake into the small hours, the war horse tethered just outside the kitchen window, its gaze fixed on the dark line of trees. Bounty hunters and the price of silence. The first snow had hardened into a crust of ice when the bounty men rode in. They came from the south, two of them skin-browned by hotter suns and eyes hidden under the low brim of their hats. Each carried a long rifle across his back and a sidearm at his hip, and one had a stick of dynamite wrapped tight in oilcloth, lashed to the saddle horn like an unspoken promise. They didn't ask permission to stay. Seldom let them drink his whiskey and eat at his table, and they told loud, ugly stories over their plates, laughing in a way that didn't leave room for anyone else's voice. Lona watched them from the kitchen doorway. They carried themselves like men who'd killed often enough to stop caring whether the killing was clean. That night, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters like teeth. She heard them settle in the scrape of boots, the slam of the bunkhouse door, voices muffled by distance. The warhorse shifted in the yard, ears pricked toward the east wing. By dawn, neither bounty man would see the sun again. One never made it back to his bed. His rifle was found propped against the fence, a slick smear of blood frozen on the stock. The other was discovered seated upright in the parlor chair, eyes gone mouth stuffed full of salt. The cold had kept the blood from pooling. When the bodies were dragged out, Seldom found her in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, scrubbing the long oak table with salt and ash. He leaned on the doorframe. "You think what's out there came from in here?" She didn't answer. He let the silence stretch before giving a short nod. "Fine. You see something you don't like, burn it. Just don't come running to me after." The haunted rooms of the East Wing. The East Wing was colder than the rest of the house, the air dry enough to split skin. She opened the first room at dusk. It held nothing but a single chair and a rope looped from the ceiling beam, the noose swaying gently, though no draft moved the air. Dust lay thick on the floor undisturbed, but for a single set of footprints leading in and stopping at the chair. The next room was worse. Dozens of dolls sat in a heap against the far wall, their porcelain faces shattered nails driven through the eyes, mouths, and temples. The smell of mildew and something older, something gone sweet with rot, hung heavy. A third room had its walls lined with paintings. Everyone turned to face the wall, the canvas backs marked with strange black smears. The beds here were made with military precision sheets pulled tight over forms shaped like men. Lona did not pull them back. She moved methodically door to door, her steps soundless. At the end of the hall, a locked door stood out its wood, darker, the frame reinforced with iron bands. She pressed her ear to it and froze. Breathing slow, wet, uneven rose from the other side, too deep to belong to any living man. She stepped back without touching the handle. Memory of the fort. That night the wind came harder than it had in weeks, slipping through the cracks in the rafters and wailing like a woman mourning. The warhorse stomped in the yard until its hooves tore the ground foam, wetting the corners of its mouth. Lona didn't sleep. She sat in the kitchen with her rifle across her knees, staring into the fire until it blurred. Her mind went back to Fort Laramie, not the way the stories told it, but the way it had truly been. The prisoners kept in cells beneath the chapel, the smell of damp stone and unwashed bodies. The experiments, the children, and then the fire not lit by the enemy, but by their own hands, phosphorus shells cracked open like eggs. The blaze eating the walls, the screams rising through the smoke. She remembered her commanding officer leaning close, voice low in her ear as the fort burned. "They'll follow the strongest." And you lived. Then the sound of his knife across his own throat. It had been years since she'd heard those words, but now, sitting in Seldom's kitchen, she felt the truth of them pressing in again. Whatever was behind that locked door in the east wing, it had followed her, and it hadn't come for Seldom. Confrontation about Fort Laram. It was late, the kind of late when even the wind had gone quiet, when Seldom stopped coming to the main table for supper. He took his meals alone upstairs now in a study that smelled faintly of whisker and dust. Lona brought him a plate one night, the meat still steaming, and found him sitting with his back to the fire, staring out the dark window as though there was something out there worth seeing. "You were part of what happened," he said without turning. His voice had no rise in it, no heat, just the flat weight of a man stating a fact he'd been sure of for a long time. She didn't answer. "At Laramie," he added, almost like an afterthought, but the way his jaw tightened told her it wasn't. "My brother was there. Private Jonas Seldom. Medical Corps." Her eyes flickered to the shelves behind him. Books leaned against old journals, the leather spines cracked. They sent back his dog tags. Seldom continued. Not his body. She stayed in the doorway, plate balanced in her hand. He was soft, Seldom said. Liked animals. Drew birds in the margins of his reports. He wouldn't have hurt anyone. Her gaze found his steady and without apology. Everyone hurt someone there. The fire popped, throwing sparks against the grate. Whatever Seldom might have said after that, he swallowed. He waved a hand toward the desk. "Leave it." She set the plate down and turned and left the air in the room feeling colder on her back than the hallway beyond. Warning from the Ash Child. The boy came again the next evening, but something about him had changed. He looked older, face sharper, eyes more hollow, though the space between his visits was too short for real years. His tin soldier was gone. Instead, a strip of leather was tied around his wrist, stained dark in patches that weren't quite dirt. "Did you burn it?" he asked. "Not yet," she said. "You should. Before it gets out." His voice was flatter than before, like he was repeating someone else's words. She crouched so they were at eye level. "What is it?" He blinked slowly, his pupils swallowing what little lamplight there was. "The memory. You left it behind, but it didn't die. It grew teeth." Her eyes dropped to the leather at his wrist. "Whose was this?" His lips peeled back into a grin too wide for his face. "Mine." Before she could reach for him, he dissolved, no smoke, no mist, just fine black ash, spilling soundlessly onto the floor. It was warm when it touched her hands. The war horse screamed from the yard, a deep, violent sound that rolled through the walls like cannon fire. By the time she reached the window, it had torn loose from its post, splintering the hitching beam. It was already halfway across the yard, snow spraying from its hooves, heading for the ravine where the first ranch hand had gone missing. She followed barefoot in the snow, her breath coming in slow clouds. The door opens, and Jonas Seldom reveals himself. The ravine smelled of scorched earth. In its base was a hole circular and fresh, the edges rimmed in black. Whatever had dug it hadn't gone down, it had come up. She fired a single round into the dark. The sound ricocheted off stone and vanished into silence. By dawn, the guards were leaving. Some rode, some walked, all refusing to look her in the eye. They muttered about devils in the basement, about curses too old for bullets. Lona said nothing. Instead, she spent the day salting the thresholds, dragging white lines across doorways, smudging soot into old sigils on the windows. Her grandmother's voice came to her as she worked. "If the dead knock, don't answer. If they cry, don't weep. If they ask for their name, lie." When the sun dropped, she went to the locked door in the east wing, her palm pressed to the cold wood. "Jonas, Seldom," she whispered. The breathing on the other side stopped, then laughter. Low, uneven, inhuman. The latch lifted on its own. Hinges groaned. The door eased inward to reveal a corridor narrower than it should have been, its walls warped and damped the air thick with mold and iron. She moved forward, rifle slung every step sinking into the sound of her own heartbeat. At the end waited a room. The light came from a lantern on the floor, its flame an unnatural blue. Chains were bolted to the wall. A cot sagged in the corner, soiled and stained. Jonas stood in the center, or what was left of him. Bone jutted under skin gone thin and gray, his jaw pulled into a chattering half-grin. One arm gone at the shoulder, the other dragging a bundle wrapped in linen wet and dark with blood. His eyes were milky, but flames flickered inside them. Lona raised her rifle, fired once. The bullet passed through him like smoke. He stepped forward. She aimed for his head and fired again, same result. Same smoke, same reek of burnt wheat and gun oil. The bundle fell from his grip, unspooling into something child-sized, boneless, twitching. She kicked it into the corner. Jonas opened his mouth and screamed not a sound, but a flood of memory. The barracks burning, the children's cries, the officers drunk on cruelty, her own hands cracking open crates of phosphorus shells. "Enough," she whispered. The memory shattered. Jonas vanished into ash. The last conversation with Seldom. When she came back up from the east wing, ash clinging to her boots and the smell of mold still in her lungs, Seldom was waiting in the parlor. The fire there had burned down to coals glowing like the eye of something half asleep. A pistol lay on the table in front of him beside a half-empty bottle, the glass sweating into a dark ring on the wood. "You saw him?" he asked. His voice was stripped bare, not quite steady. "Oh, yes," she said, setting her rifle against the wall. Seldom didn't drink from his glass. His gaze was fixed on the pistol as though the weight of it alone could decide the next move. "He's been here a long time. I know. I didn't want him dead. I wanted him punished." She sat across from him, the war horse's shadow spilling across the window behind her. "You kept him in chains. That wasn't justice." His eyes dropped. I remember my brother laughing, picking flowers for our mother. He didn't deserve the fort. No one did. The words hung there raw and unclaimed. Then, without looking up, Seldom pushed the pistol across the table toward her. "You can take the house. I've had enough." She didn't touch the gun. "I don't want the house." "Then burn it." He stood and left the room without another word, boots whispering against the rug. She didn't follow. Somewhere above his footsteps climbed the stairs, then faded entirely. Ash and the thing left behind. She started that same night. Packing was quick, there was little to take. She salted the baseboards, drew sigils in soot across the windows, then left the east wing's door wide open as though daring whatever was left to cross the threshold. Outside she found the war horse waiting by the gate. She pressed her forehead briefly to its own, the two of them breathing in the same cold air. Then she lit a match. The fire took to the old timbers fast. Flames roared through the halls like they had been waiting for the excuse. By dawn, the house was a blackened skeleton on the land, smoke curling upward in thick, hungry ribbons. She stood by the charred arch of the gate, watching until the last of the roof fell. But it didn't burn clean. By noon the next day the ruins still smoldered, tongues of flame licking at the foundation like starving things. The smoke climbed high into the winter sky and hung there, unmoving like the clouds themselves were holding their breath. Seldom was gone. If he had burned with the house, there was no sign, no tooth, no buckle, not even the echo of a scream. But she knew something had crawled free. That night, the coyotes came in a wide ring around the ruins, silent, watching with eyes that caught the last glow of the embers. The war horse didn't rest. Neither did she. Arrival of the U.S. Marshals, dawn came hard and colorless, the frost deep enough to crack under her boots. She was sharpening her knife by the fire when she heard the hoofbeats, 3 riders descending from the ridge steady, and measured not the gallop of raiders or ranch hands. They came dressed in dust and authority hats, low coats buttoned tight against the wind. U.S. Marshals, each one wearing a badge that caught the pale sun. They dismounted without speaking. "You Briggs the oldest?" asked voice, graveled with years on the trail. She nodded once. He pulled a folded parchment from his coat. "We have a warrant from the federal government, signed by the Attorney General. You're to be taken in for questioning regarding the Fort Laram incident, the deaths at Deadmare Bluff, and the disappearance of Whit Seldom." She didn't flinch. "You gonna come quiet?" he asked. "I ain't going," she said. "You'll hang." "Maybe." The second marshal stepped forward, reaching for his cuffs. The war horse moved first, no snort, no scream, just a sudden lunge that cracked the ground. The first marshal was thrown back before he could draw his weapon. The second stumbled, hand caught in his belt. The third tried to aim, but Lona was already on him, knife slicing clean across his wrist. Gunfire tore the morning open. When the dust settled, 2 marshals lay in the frost, bleeding into the dirt. The third, young barely past boyhood, stood with both hands raised. "Please," he whispered. "I didn't come to die." Her blade dripped onto the snow. "I did," she said. He ran. She didn't follow. Instead, she turned west, the war horse falling into step beside her. Behind them, the smoke from the ruins of the house still smeared the sky like a wound that wouldn't close. The legend grows. They spoke of her in towns she never set foot in, over bar counters and at campfires, far from Deadmare Bluff. Stories grew in the telling how she rode with a ghost horse whose hooves left no prints, how she could shoot a crow out of the sky without raising her voice, how she never laughed and never stayed anywhere long enough for the seasons to turn. Some claimed she slept only beside rivers, the sound of water masking the cries of those she had left behind. Others said that wherever she passed, old grudges came to light, and bad men ended up in the ground, and that the soil over their graves smoldered for days after. She rode through the Badlands first, where the wind cut sharp between stone pillars and the sun seemed to scrape the skin raw. She took work when it was offered, driving cattle, breaking horses, but never gave a name unless she had to, and never stayed more than a few weeks. To the ones who asked, she was just a woman with a horse too fine for ranch work and a rifle worn slick from use. To the ones who didn't ask, she was something else entirely, a shadow in a wide-brimmed hat, a figure the desert seemed to keep for itself. And still, no matter how far she went, the smell of burned powder and wet ash followed her like a second scent. Confrontation with Colonel Avery. The mountains took her next. Winter, there was cruel, a white weight that pressed down until even sound seemed to freeze. She trapped game for a dying widow, her hands raw from skinning hides in the cold. She helped a girl deliver a breech calf in a blizzard, her breath fogging in the lamplight. She spoke only when spoken to, but the dreams came heavy and relentless. Fort Laram the fire, the children's screams, and in them always the breathing from behind the locked door. One night she woke to voices in the snow. The words were not in English, not in any tongue she'd heard in years, but they carried the cadence of orders barked over chaos. She found no tracks in the morning, yet she left camp anyway, climbing higher into the pass until she reached a cave. She stayed there for days, painting the walls with symbols in ash and blood marks her grandmother had taught her for when death walked close. On the last night of the coldest month, something waited at the cave mouth. Colonel Avery, clean coat boots, polished eyes like glacial ice. The man who had ordered the burn. He didn't speak. She didn't reach for her rifle. They stood inches apart, breath mingling in the freezing air. His mouth opened, not to speak but to scream. She leaned forward and kissed his cheek. He collapsed into bones, the snow swallowing them without a sound. When she looked back, the cave behind her was sealed shut. Arrival in the mining camp. Spring came late to the high country. Snow clung to the ridgelines like an old grudge, melting slow into rivers that roared with cold water. She rode down through the thaw clothes, stiff with smoke and pine sap, her hair tied back with sinew thread. The war horse was leaner but still watchful, picking its way over rock no other beast would have trusted. She came to a valley where the soil was black and soft, and widows grew onions in rows between cabins made of rough pine. Knives hung beside their doors' handles worn smooth from use. A mining camp had sprung up there, raw fast, and full of men who drank their wages and took their anger out on mules. Lona took work as a cook. She salted her own water, burned her trash, carved protective sigils into the cooking stones. She never told anyone her name. At night, she walked the perimeter barefoot, pressing her palm to the earth, listening. Whatever had trailed her down from the mountains was quieter now, but not gone. Sometimes she'd wake to weeping in the hills low and distant. Not human. Not entirely memory either. One morning, a man in a grey coat rode into camp, older with a southern drawl and eyes red-rimmed like a hound's. He said his name was Carrick and he was looking for his daughter, a girl with braids who had a doll named Wren. She'd gone missing after the fort burned. Lona poured him coffee. He studied her across the rim of his cup. Funny thing, he said softly. You got her eyes. She didn't answer. That night, the war horse trampled his tent. In the ashes, they found bones too small to belong to Carrick ribs wrapped in military canvas. Final symbol and the endless road. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Lona had already packed her. She moved without sound, rolling her few belongings into a bundle that tied tight to the saddle. The widow who ran the boarding house was waiting for her at the doorway. Shawl pulled tight around her shoulders against the valley's lingering chill. In her hand was a tin badge, tarnished the edges, worn smooth by years of rubbing. This was my husband, she said, before they shot him for turning evidence. She didn't ask Lona to wear it. She didn't need to. Lona took it, weighing it in her palm. It was heavier than it looked, the kind of weight that could anchor or drown. She slipped it into a coat pocket without a word. The war horse stood at the hitching post, steam rising from its nostrils in the cold air. Its ears flicked toward the hills as though still hearing whatever had haunted the nights here. Lona swung into the saddle. The widows in the onion fields paused their work to watch her leave their knives glinting in the morning light. She rode west into land that had no name on any map worth keeping. The gullies deepened, the soil turned red, and the sky seemed wider than it had a right to be. Stories trailed in her wake, always a half-day behind, always heavier in the retelling. Some said she left crosses burned into the earth where bad men died. Others swore she could walk her war horse across rivers without breaking the surface. A few whispered that she was no longer entirely human, that the fire at Fort Laram had burned something out of her and replaced it with ash and hunger. She didn't care what they believed. Justice, vengeance, those were just words men used to give shape to things they couldn't control. What she carried was older. It had no name, no law, no mercy. The road narrowed into a cut between two hills, wind funneling through in long, low moans. She passed graves with no stones, just heaps of rock where the dirt had been disturbed. Each one felt like a story she didn't have time to hear. She kept riding. The land began to change, fewer trees, more stone, the smell of dry heat on the wind. Somewhere behind her, always at the edge of hearing, came the steady clop of hooves. The war horse never looked back, but its pace never faltered. As the day stretched long and the light thinned, she found herself cresting a rise that opened onto a plain lit gold by the dying sun. In the far distance, a line of smoke twisted upward from somewhere unseen. She couldn't tell if it came from a chimney, a campfire, or something burning that shouldn't be. She touched the tin badge in her pocket, once not as a pledge but as a reminder of the things she'd been given and the things she'd taken. Then she let her hand fall back to the reins. Behind her, the war horse snorted a sound that felt almost like agreement. Ahead of her, the horizon waited wide and unblinking. She leaned forward in the saddle, and the two of them rode on toward whatever had the nerve to still be standing. And somewhere in the dust, they left behind the memory of the fort, kept pace, quiet, patient, never letting her go.